The room looked like something from a magazine. Crystal lights hung from the ceiling, throwing soft gold reflections across marble floors. Long tables were dressed in white cloth, covered with fine plates, shining glasses, and carefully folded napkins. Every detail was perfect, planned weeks in advance to impress the people who mattered most in the city. Guests arrived in waves. Expensive shoes clicked across the floor. Voices carried confidence, pride, and comfort. People greeted one another with practiced smiles, talking about business deals, vacations, and achievements. It was the kind of place where everyone knew their value, or at least believed they did. Moving quietly among them was a server, dressed in a simple uniform, clean but plain. The server blended into the background. A tray rested steadily in their hands, filled with drinks that cost more than a week of wages. The server moved carefully, politely, always stepping aside, always lowering their voice. Most guests barely looked up when a glass was placed in front of them. The server had worked events like this before: weddings, private dinners, fundraisers. The rooms were always beautiful, and the people were always important. But the server was never part of that importance. They were there to serve, to disappear, to make sure everything ran smoothly without being noticed. Still, tonight felt different. At the far end of the hall stood a grand piano, black, polished, and flawless. It rested under a soft spotlight as if it were another honored guest. No one had touched it yet. It was there for later, for a scheduled performance by a well-known musician who would arrive near the end of the night. Each time the server passed by that side of the room, their eyes drifted toward the piano, just for a second, just long enough to feel something familiar tighten in their chest. The sound of imagined keys echoed in their mind, even though the room was filled with laughter and conversation. The server had learned long ago how to hide that look. They had learned how to keep their face calm, their steps even, their focus on work. Life had taught them that certain dreams were better kept quiet. The guests did not notice any of this. To them, the server was just part of the service. Someone who appeared when needed and vanished just as quickly. A group near the center table spoke loudly, their voices rising above the rest. They were clearly comfortable here. One of them laughed and waved a hand in the air, nearly knocking over a glass. The server rushed over, apologizing softly, replacing the drink before it spilled. "Careful," one guest said with a light chuckle. "Not unkind, but not thoughtful either." Double quotes. "Yes, of course," the server replied, voice calm and respectful. As the server stepped away, another guest glanced toward the piano. "Nice touch, having that here," they said. "Makes the place feel classy." Someone else nodded. "Shame it's just sitting there." The server heard this while passing by, but said nothing. Their hands tightened slightly around the tray. In a corner of the room, an older guest sat quietly, watching everything. They noticed how the server moved differently when near the piano. Not enough for anyone else to care, but enough for someone who had learned to read people over a lifetime. The older guest did not say anything, only observed. As the evening went on, the noise grew louder. Plates were cleared. New drinks were served. Laughter filled the room. The server continued working, feet aching, back stiff, but posture straight. This job paid well for the night, and every shift mattered. During a short pause, the server stood near the piano again, waiting for a signal to assist another table. The polished surface reflected their image. For a brief moment, the server saw not a uniform, but someone else. Someone from another time, another place. They quickly looked away. A guest noticed this time. "Hey," they said, half smiling. "You play?" The question was casual, almost a joke. The server froze for half a second. "No," they said automatically. It was the safest answer. The guest laughed lightly. "Looked like you were thinking about it. I was just waiting," the server replied, lowering their eyes. The guest shrugged and turned back to their group. The moment passed, but something had shifted. A few others had heard the exchange. Some smiled. Some looked curious. Others didn't care at all. The server moved on, heart beating a little faster than before. They remembered an old room with peeling paint and a worn-out piano missing two keys. They remembered cold mornings and long nights. They remembered practicing quietly so neighbors would not complain. They remembered being told that music was nice, but survival was necessary. Those memories stayed locked inside as the server continued working. Near the back of the room, a coordinator checked their watch. The scheduled pianist was running late, very late. A small frown appeared on their face as they whispered urgently into a phone. The guests began to notice the delay. Someone joked about dead air. Another asked when the music would start. The piano sat silently, waiting. The server passed by again, unaware that the night was slowly moving towards something none of them had planned. For now, they were just a server, just another worker in a room full of powerful people, just another unnoticed presence carrying trays and clearing plates. But the piano remained in the corner, quiet and patient, as if it already knew that its silence would not last much longer. The night continued to move forward, but a small restlessness began to spread through the room. Guests checked their phones more often. Some leaned back in their chairs, waiting. Others spoke louder, trying to fill the space that silence was starting to create. The coordinator paced near the wall, lowering their voice as they spoke into the phone again. The pianist was still not there. Traffic, delays, excuses that sounded thin with every passing minute. The server noticed the change before most people did. Working these events had taught them how to read a room. They felt the shift in energy like a quiet hum under the noise. Something was off. As plates were cleared and desserts were delayed, the piano remained untouched. The spotlight above it felt too bright now, almost awkward, like it was shining on a promise that had not been kept. A guest near the front table laughed and shook their head. So much build-up for nothing, they said. I thought there was supposed to be music. Another replied, maybe the piano is just for decoration. A few people chuckled. The server stood nearby, refilling glasses. Their hands moved automatically, but their thoughts were far away. Every joke about the piano felt heavier than it should have. The server reminded themselves to stay focused. This was not their place. The coordinator finally ended the call and let out a slow breath. They scanned the room, clearly stressed. Canceling the performance would leave a gap in the evening, one that guests would remember for the wrong reasons. A guest caught the coordinator's eye. Any update? They asked. The coordinator forced a smile. Just a short delay, they said, hoping it sounded convincing. Near the piano, the server paused again. They had been asked to wait there in case more drinks were needed. Standing so close made it harder to ignore the pull they felt. The polished keys reflected the lights above, clean and untouched. The server remembered the first time they had touched a piano like this. Not this exact one, but one just as grand. They had been younger then, standing in a quiet hall after hours, hands shaking as they pressed the keys for the first time. The sound had filled the empty space and stayed with them long after. A voice pulled them back. You really like that piano, don't you? The server turned. It was one of the guests from earlier, the one who had joked before. Their tone was playful, but curious. The server hesitated. It's a nice instrument, they said carefully. The guest smiled. Do you play? The server shook their head quickly. No, I just appreciate music, the guest said, clearly unconvinced. But they didn't push. They turned back to their table, though a few others nearby had heard the exchange. The older guest in the corner continued watching. They noticed the way the server stood near the piano, not touching it, not staring openly, but aware of it in a way that came from familiarity. The older guest folded their hands and waited. Minutes passed. The delay became impossible to hide. The coordinator stepped forward and tapped a glass gently to get attention. Conversation slowed. Thank you for your patience, they said. We are experiencing a slight issue with our scheduled performance. We are working to resolve it. Murmurs spread across the room. Some guests nodded politely. Others sighed. Someone called out, half joking, anyone here know how to play? Laughter followed. The server felt their stomach tighten. They kept their eyes down, pretending to adjust the tray. The joking continued. What about you? A guest said suddenly, pointing toward the server. You've been eyeing it all night. The words were light, but they landed hard. A few people turned to look. Smiles, raised eyebrows, expectation mixed with amusement. The server felt heat rise to their face. I'm sorry, they said quietly. I'm just working. Oh, come on, another guest said. Just a few notes. We won't judge. That made more people laugh. The coordinator froze, unsure how to respond. They did not want to embarrass a staff member, but they also felt the pressure of the room. The server stood still, heart pounding. This was exactly the kind of attention they had learned to avoid. Attention like this could turn sharp very quickly. I really can't, the server said again, voice steady but low. For a moment, it seemed like that would be the end of it. But then the older guest finally spoke. Let them decide, the older guest said calmly. Their voice was not loud, but it carried. No one should be pushed. The room quieted a little. The server glanced toward the older guest, surprised. Gratitude flickered across their face before they looked down again. The coordinator cleared their throat. Of course, they said. No pressure. But the idea had already taken root. Whispers moved from table to table. Some guests were curious, others amused. A few looked thoughtful. The piano, silent for so long, now felt like the center of the room. The server stepped away, finishing their duties at another table, trying to calm their breathing. They reminded themselves that this night would end like every other. They would go home tired, count their tips, and move on. Yet something inside them refused to settle. They thought of all the times they had walked away from music because it felt safer. All the times they had told themselves it was enough just to remember, enough just to listen. The coordinator approached quietly. "I want to say this clearly," they said in a low voice. "You are not required to do anything outside your job." The server nodded. "I understand, but," the coordinator added, hesitating, "if you do happen to play, even a little, it might help us tonight." The server looked at the piano again. It had waited all evening. They took a slow breath. "I don't play professionally," the server said. "That's okay," the coordinator replied. "This isn't about perfection." The room watched, pretending not to. The server stood between two worlds. One was safe, quiet, familiar. The other was risky, exposed, uncertain. After a long moment, the server nodded once. "I can try something simple," they said. A ripple of surprise moved through the room. The server handed off the tray, walked slowly toward the piano, and sat down. Their hands hovered above the keys, not touching them yet. The room fell into a waiting silence. The server sat still for a moment, hands hovering above the keys. The piano felt different up close, bigger, louder, more exposed. The soft lights above reflected on the black surface, and for a second, the server became very aware of every person in the room. The noise had faded. No laughter, no clinking glasses, just quiet attention. The server placed both feet firmly on the floor. They took a slow breath, the kind they used to take long ago before playing for themselves, alone. This was not supposed to happen, not here, not like this. A few guests leaned forward. Others crossed their arms, curious but doubtful. Some wore polite smiles, expecting nothing more than a short, awkward tune. The server gently pressed one key. The sound was soft but clear. It carried farther than expected, floating across the room. A few heads tilted. No one spoke. Another note followed, then another. The server's fingers began to move, slowly at first, as if testing the piano's voice. The sound grew warmer, fuller. The melody was simple, but steady, honest. Something shifted. The server stopped thinking about the room, the lights, the people, the uniforms. Their shoulders relaxed as memory took over. Years of quiet practice returned through muscle and instinct. The music began to breathe. At one table, a guest lowered their glass without realizing it. At another, someone straightened in their chair. Conversations that had tried to restart faded again. The server's hands moved with more confidence now. The melody deepened, weaving gentle rises and falls. It was not loud or flashy. It did not demand attention. It invited it. The older guest in the corner closed their eyes. The server felt the weight of the day slowly slip away. The aching feet, the tired back, the feeling of being unseen. None of it mattered right now. There was only the piano and the sound filling the space between people. A few guests exchanged glances. This was not what they expected. The melody shifted slightly, becoming more emotional, not sad, but heavy with feeling. Like a story being told without words. One guest near the front swallowed hard. They did not know why their chest felt tight. The server played on. They remembered cold rooms and borrowed instruments. They remembered practicing when no one was listening, and stopping when footsteps came close. They remembered being told that music was beautiful, but unreliable. Those memories flowed into the keys. The piano responded with a rich sound that filled every corner of the room. Even the staff had stopped moving. A few servers stood near the walls, watching quietly, forgetting their tasks for a moment. The coordinator stood frozen, hands clasped together, eyes wide. The music grew stronger. The server's fingers moved faster now, more sure. The melody rose, then softened again, like a deep breath after holding it too long. A guest wiped their eye, surprised to find it wet. No one laughed now. No one whispered. The room listened. The server leaned slightly closer to the piano, completely absorbed. The world outside the music had faded. There was no uniform, no audience, just sound and feeling moving together. The melody reached a gentle peak, then slowly began to fall. Each note felt deliberate, careful, full of meaning. Someone near the back of the room let out a quiet breath they did not realize they had been holding. The older guest opened their eyes. The final notes came softly, like footsteps fading down a hallway. The server's hands slowed, then rested lightly on the keys. Silence followed, not the awkward kind, the heavy kind, the kind that asks to be respected. No one moved for a moment. It felt like the entire room was holding still, afraid to break whatever had just passed through it. Then a single clap sounded. It came from the older guest. Another followed, then another. Applause spread across the room, growing louder, fuller, not polite, not forced, real. Some guests stood without thinking. Others remained seated but clapped just as hard. A few brushed tears from their faces, embarrassed but unmoved by that embarrassment. The server stood up slowly, unsure what to do. Their heart was racing. Their hands trembled slightly now that the music had stopped. They bowed their head briefly, more out of habit than expectation. The applause continued. The coordinator stepped forward, smiling openly now. "Thank you," they said, voice thick with emotion. The server nodded, still processing what had happened. As the clapping faded, the room buzzed with quiet energy. People leaned toward one another, whispering. Some shook their heads in disbelief. "I had no idea," one guest murmured. Another said softly, "That was beautiful." The server stepped away from the piano, ready to return to work. Old habits pulled at them. The moment was over. Life would go back to normal. But it didn't. A guest stood up and approached the server carefully, as if afraid to disturb them. "Thank you," they said. "I needed that more than I realized." The server nodded, unsure how to respond. "I'm glad," they said quietly. Another guest followed, then another. The server felt overwhelmed. They were not used to being seen like this. The older guest rose slowly and walked toward them. "You didn't just play notes," they said. "You shared something real." The server met their eyes and saw nothing but respect. "Thank you for listening," the server replied. The coordinator cleared their throat gently. "We'll take care of the rest of the evening," they said. "You can take a short break if you need." The server nodded, stepping aside. As they moved away, they glanced back at the piano. It no longer felt distant or untouchable. The room had changed. And so had the server. The room did not return to normal after the applause faded. It settled into something quieter, softer, like people were walking more carefully inside their own thoughts. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, slower, lower, less about deals and status, more about feelings that had been stirred without warning. The server stood near the wall, holding a glass of water the coordinator had given them. Their hands were still shaking a little. The rush of the moment had passed, leaving behind a mix of relief, disbelief, and fear. They kept asking themselves if they had done the wrong thing, if they had crossed an invisible line. A fellow server walked over quietly. "I didn't know you could do that," they whispered, eyes wide. The server gave a small smile. "Most people don't." Across the room, guests kept glancing toward the piano, then back at the server, as if trying to connect to different images of the same person. Some looked thoughtful. Others looked uncomfortable, as if something inside them had been challenged. One guest spoke to another in a low voice. "Makes you wonder how many people we overlook every day." The words hung in the air longer than they realized. The older guest sat again, watching the room with quiet satisfaction. They had seen moments like this before. Moments when a carefully built world cracked just enough to let truth in. The coordinator approached the server once more. "I want to apologize," they said. "We didn't mean to put you on the spot." The server shook their head. "It's okay. I chose to sit down." "I'm glad you did," the coordinator replied. That changed the entire night. The server didn't know how to respond to that. They took another sip of water and nodded. As the evening continued, guests began approaching one by one. Not all at once, not loudly, quietly, respectfully. One said, "I haven't felt that calm in years." Another said, "You reminded me why I loved music in the first place." A third simply said, "Thank you." Each comment landed gently but deeply. The server listened more than they spoke. They were not used to being thanked like this, not for something that mattered. One guest hesitated before speaking. "I hope this doesn't sound strange," they said, "but where did you learn to play like that?" The server paused. "Anywhere I could," they answered honestly. The guest nodded, understanding more than the words explained. Not everyone reacted warmly. A few guests kept their distance, their smiles tight. One whispered to another, clearly bothered. This wasn't part of the program, they muttered. But even they could not undo what had already happened. The scheduled pianist finally arrived near the end of the evening. They apologized profusely to the coordinator, carrying their music sheets and wearing a nervous smile. The coordinator glanced toward the piano, then toward the server. "We won't need a full performance anymore," they said gently. "But thank you for coming." The pianist looked confused, then curious. "Did I miss something?" The coordinator smiled. "Yes, but in a good way." The server watched from a distance, feeling a strange mix of guilt and pride. They never meant to replace anyone. They had only followed something they could not ignore. As guests began preparing to leave, coats were collected and goodbyes exchanged. The energy of the room felt lighter now, less rushed. The older guest approached the server once more. "May I sit for a moment?" they asked. The server nodded, surprised. They sat at a small table away from the noise. "You know," the older guest said, "I've spent my life in rooms like this. I've heard many trained performers. What you did was different." The server looked down. "I'm not trained like them." "That's exactly why it mattered," the older guest replied. "You played from a place people forget exists." The server felt a lump rise in their throat. The older guest continued, "Don't let tonight become just a story you tell yourself once and then bury." The server met their eyes. "I don't even know what tonight means yet." "That's okay," the older guest said. "You don't have to know right now." They stood and placed a small card on the table. "If you ever decide you want to talk about music again, not as a hobby, but as a part of your life, reach out." The server picked up the card, hands trembling slightly. "I don't make promises lightly," the older guest added, "but I recognize honesty when I hear it." Then they walked away. The server sat there long after, staring at the card. When the hall finally emptied, the staff began cleaning. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Leftover glasses were gathered. The magic of the evening faded into routine sounds. The server returned to work, wiping tables, stacking plates, moving like they always did. But something inside them had shifted. They passed the piano one last time. The lid was closed now, the spotlight turned off. The server rested a hand on its smooth surface for a brief moment, then pulled away outside. The night air was cool and quiet. The server stepped out of the building, uniform jacket pulled tight. The city lights glowed in the distance. They took a deep breath. For the first time in a long while, the future did not feel completely closed. They did not know what would come next. They only knew that something true had been shared, and it could not be taken back. The server walked home under the streetlights, carrying more than tips in their pocket. They carried possibility. The days after the event felt strange to the server. Life went on as usual, yet nothing felt exactly the same. They woke up early, put on the same uniform, and reported to work like always. Plates were served, floors were cleaned, guests came and went. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. The sound of the piano followed the server everywhere, not as noise, but as memory. While carrying trays or wiping tables, they would suddenly remember the stillness of that room, the way people listened, the way the air felt heavy and calm at the same time. They tried to push those thoughts away. This job paid the bills. Dreams did not. But something had been unlocked, and it refused to stay quiet. One afternoon, during a break, the server pulled the small card from their pocket. They had not shown it to anyone. They had not called. They had barely even looked at it. It felt dangerous, like opening a door they had spent years keeping shut. They turned the card over slowly, then slipped it back into their pocket. That night, after work, the server did something they had not done in a long time. They walked past their usual bus stop and kept going. At the end of a quiet street stood a small community hall. Inside, through a dusty window, they could see an old, upright piano. The door was unlocked. The server stepped inside, heart beating fast. The room smelled faintly of wood and dust. The piano was worn, keys slightly yellowed, but familiar. They sat down and placed their hands on the keys. The first notes came out shaky, then steadier. They played softly, just for themselves. No applause followed. No audience listened. And yet, it felt just as important. The server returned the next day, and the day after that. Music became something private again, but no longer hidden. Weeks passed. One evening, the server finally dialed the number on the card. They almost hung up before it connected. A calm voice answered. They spoke briefly. Nothing dramatic, just an invitation to meet and talk. The meeting took place in a quiet room with a simple piano. No stage, no spotlight. The server played again. This time, they did not feel nervous. The older guest listened, hands folded, eyes kind. When the server finished, there was no long speech, just a nod. You still belong to this. The older guest said. The words settled gently, not like pressure, but like truth. Opportunities did not appear overnight. There were no sudden promises of fame or wealth. Instead, there were small steps, practice sessions, honest feedback, chances to play in modest spaces for small groups of people. The server kept their job. They needed it. But now, there was something else. They played at a local shelter one evening, at a hospital lobby another day. Sometimes only a few people stopped to listen. Sometimes none did. That was okay. Music had never been about crowds. One night, after a long shift, a co-worker asked quietly, "Do you still play?" The server smiled. Yes, the word felt strong. Months later, the same elite hall hosted another event. This time, the server was not working there. They were invited. They stood near the back of the room, wearing borrowed clothes that fit better than expected. The piano waited under the lights again. When they were introduced, there was no laughter, no jokes. Only silence. The server walked to the piano. Now simply a person, not a role. They played. The music flowed easily, without fear. Not because they had changed, but because they had accepted who they were. Some of the same guests were there. A few recognized them. Their expressions softened with understanding. Tears appeared again, but this time, they came without surprise. Afterward, the server stepped outside alone, breathing in the night air. They were not rich. They were not famous, but they were whole. The world had not magically transformed, but their place in it had. Sometimes, people are more than what they appear to be. Sometimes, all it takes is one moment of courage for the truth to be heard. The server walked forward, carrying their life with steady hands, and the music walked with them.